By the time Nora Whitfield knocked on the kitchen door of the Talley Ranch, her youngest boy had stopped crying from hunger. That was what frightened her. A child could holler through cold and dust and blistered feet for half a day if there was still fight in him. Silence meant the body had started saving its strength for more serious work. Toby leaned against her skirt like a folded rag. Levi stood on her other side with his jaw locked, so hard the muscles quivered. Liza had one hand wrapped around the handle of the tin pail that held everything they still owned, and the other pressed flat to her little brother's back, as if she could keep him upright by sheer will. The kitchen door opened on heat, beef fat, and wood smoke. A broad man with white at his temples stood there holding a coffee cup that looked too delicate for his hand. His hat brim had left a permanent pale band across his forehead. His eyes went first to the children, then to Nora's shoes, then to the road behind her, as if measuring how far desperation had walked to reach his step. From deeper inside, another voice snapped. "If that's one more peddler, tell him we ain't charitable." Nora lifted her chin before the old shame could reach her face. "I'm not selling. I'm asking for work." The white-templed man didn't answer right away. Somewhere behind him, beans boiled over with a hiss. A screen banged. A dog barked at the horse lot. Everything in that doorway smelled like life still happening while hers stood one bad minute from breaking apart. Then the man said, quiet as a man laying down a card, "Can you cook for 18 hungry idiots and keep 3 children out from under boot heels?" "I can cook for 25, Nora said. "And my children know how to stay where they're told." The sharper voice came closer. A lean man in a clean vest and town-polished boots appeared at the old cowboy's shoulder. He looked Nora over the way a buyer looked at a chipped plate. "We're not taking in strays, Boone." So that was his name. Boone Talley never turned to him. He kept looking at Nora. "You got anything left in that pail besides grit?" "Half a sack of flour. 2 onions. A little salt." One corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. Something older and more tired than that. He reached to a peg beside the door, took down a faded blue apron, and held it out to her. "Then tie this on," he said. "If supper's on the table before the moon clears the cottonwoods, you're the cook." The man in the vest stiffened. "You can't be serious." Boone finally glanced at him. "Virgil, if I wanted counsel, I'd ask for it. Since I didn't, you can get your boots out of my kitchen." Virgil Hayes gave Nora a look that promised he would remember her face for all the wrong reasons, then stepped back with a tight smile that never got near his eyes. "It's your ranch to bury, Talley." He walked off into the dusk. Boone still held out the apron. Up close, Nora saw the hem had been mended by careful hands years ago, the stitches fine and even. There was a flour stain near the pocket that no washing had ever quite won against. "Whose was it?" she asked before she could stop herself. "My wife's," Boone said. The warmth in the doorway shifted. "Not gone. Changed." Nora took the apron. "Before we go further, settle in wherever you are tonight and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We always like knowing who's gathered around the fire with us. Then come on back, because Nora Whitfield had just stepped into the place that was going to change every life under that roof." The Talley kitchen looked like a losing battle with walls. A pot of beans had burned to black paste. Salt pork sweated on the board. There was biscuit dough mixed wrong and abandoned in a bowl. 2 hired boys were arguing over whether coffee grounds could be used twice. A skinny yellow dog lay under the table with the expression of an animal that had seen this level of foolishness before. Nora moved without wasting breath. "Levi, water from the pump. Liza, onions peeled. Toby, stool by the stove, and you stay on it unless I call you down." She pointed at the hired boys. "You, scrape that pot and bring me the lard. You, wash your hands before you touch another thing God intended people to eat." Something in her voice made them obey before they remembered they were grown enough to object. She tipped fresh beans into the kettle, diced salt pork fine to make a little taste work harder, stretched her own flour with theirs, and set biscuits in cast iron just as the first stars came up beyond the window. When there wasn't enough broth, she browned onions deep and slow until the smell alone made a body believe supper might be richer than it was. She thinned gravy with coffee and a trick of bacon grease her mother had taught her in a Missouri winter when the cupboard showed boards between jars. Boone leaned in the doorway the whole time, not helping, not hindering, watching with the grave attention of a man witnessing a skill he understood was rare. When Toby started to slide from the stool with sleep, Boone set his coffee aside, crossed the room, and lifted the boy one-handed before he could hit the floor. Toby didn't even wake. Boone settled him on the settle by the stove and tucked an old horse blanket around him with a care so gentle it made something tighten in Nora's throat. By the time the hands came in from evening chores, there were biscuits on the table, stew in bowls, and coffee hot enough to put life back in a tired man's face. No one spoke for the first 3 minutes except to ask for more. At the end of the table, Boone bit into a biscuit, chewed once, and set it down very carefully. "Thought so," he said. Nora didn't know what he meant, but one of the older hands let out a breathy laugh and muttered, "Lord above, we may live through fall after all." She might have almost believed it herself if Virgil Hayes hadn't returned before the plates were cleared. He came back with a leather ledger under his arm and bad news folded into his smile. He spread papers on the kitchen table while the children slept by the stove and the room still smelled of biscuits. The contrast made him look colder than the night outside. "Note comes due in 12 days, he said to Boone. "You missed the cattle contract, the bank takes the south pasture, then the house, then whatever chairs ain't nailed down." Boone stood with both hands braced on the table. "I know the date." Virgil flicked a look at Nora, at the children, at the apron tied around her waist. "Then you know charity's a luxury." "She's paid help," Boone said. "With what?" No one answered. Virgil closed the ledger with one flat palm. "Your cook died, your best drover limps, and there's a sickness in 2 bunkhouses up the ridge. You're one bad week from losing everything. I'd suggest you stop collecting mouths." Nora felt every word like a door closing. She untied the apron. Boone looked at her, then at the children. "You leave after breakfast if you want." "Not tonight." His voice stayed level, but it carried iron. "Tonight they sleep under my roof." It was a small thing, maybe, to anyone who had never been turned away hungry with children hanging on both hands. But to Nora it felt like a plank laid over a river at the moment you were sure the water would take you. That was the point of no return. She tied the apron back on. The cook's cabin sat behind the kitchen under 2 cottonwoods that whispered all night, like old women trading sorrows. It was one room and a loft, with a stove that smoked and quilts smelling faintly of cedar and sun. Boone had cleaned it himself, or tried to. Nora could tell by the way the floor had been swept everywhere except the corners, where a woman's eye would have gone first. He stood awkwardly in the doorway after carrying in the children's things. "Ruth and I lived here when the house was going up," he said. "Before." "Before what?" He didn't say. Nora set the pail down. "This is more than we had yesterday." Boone nodded once. "Then I reckon yesterday can keep what belongs to it." He left before kindness could become a thing either of them had to explain. By morning, the ranch had shown Nora its true shape. The tally spread was not failing from drought or laziness. It was being bled. Sacks of coffee charged twice. Feed bills marked higher than any store in 2 counties could justify. Beef tallies that did not match the number of steers Levi counted in the lower pasture. Boone rose before dawn, worked past dark, and signed whatever Virgil said in front of him because men who could read wind, hoof prints, and cloud lines sometimes got cheated hardest by numbers on a page. Nora noticed because her late husband, Daniel, had once run freight books before fever took him in a depot town that didn't bury the poor until there were enough of them to make the digging worth a man's back. After he died, numbers had been the only language creditors ever cared to speak to her. She said nothing at first. It wasn't her ranch. It wasn't her fight. But when Virgil docked Levi's pay before the boy had earned any, claiming room and feed for the family had to come from somewhere, Nora felt something old and fierce straighten its spine inside her. That evening she laid Boone's account pages beside the flour bin and said, "Either your banker's a fool, or he's a thief." Boone looked from the paper to her face. "Virgil Hayes is no fool." "Then there's your answer." He pulled out a chair and sat as if his knees had quit arguing with him all at once. "Show me." So she did. The inflated charges. The duplicate line items. The interest measured on sums already paid. Boone listened without interrupting, one hand over his mouth, as the last pieces of a long, slow ruin clicked into place. When she finished, he stared at the lamplight trembling in the coffee cup. "Ruth handled most things done with ink," he said. "After she died, I kept telling myself I'd learn it proper when work eased." He gave a tired little shake of the head. "Work never does." Nora softened despite herself. "You're not the first good man ever robbed by a neat hand and a smooth voice." He looked up then, and in his eyes she saw not weakness but the humiliation of a decent man discovering how long he'd been made a fool of. "I can get the children and go," she said quietly, "before he decides to make examples of us." Boone leaned back. Firelight cut deep lines beside his mouth. "If leaving's safest, I'll hitch the wagon myself." There it was. The easy road, laid plain. Safety. Distance. The old familiar work of surviving one more season by disappearing before anyone powerful got tired of you. Nora glanced through the open door. Levi was at the pump with one of the hands, trying to hide how sore his shoulders were. Liza sat on the step braiding string into something meant to amuse Toby. Out in the lot, 3 men were arguing in low, tired voices about feed, winter, and whether Tally wages would hold another month. If she left, Virgil Hayes would take this place. Men would lose work. Families would lose credit. And her children would learn the lesson the world was always eager to teach. When cruelty owns the room, decent people gather their things and go quiet. "No," she said. Boone's eyes lifted. "No," she repeated, firmer now. "I'm done teaching my children to run from men like him." He held her gaze a long moment. "Hard road. Those are the only ones that ever seem open to women like me." The next morning Boone handed her the key to the account cupboard. By the 3rd day, the kitchen ran like a railroad clock. Biscuits at dawn, beans soaking before sunup, salt pork cut thin enough to stretch, thick enough to satisfy. Men started coming through the back door just to stand in the warmth and say something unnecessary while Nora worked. They weren't really there for coffee. They were there because order has a sound, and after too much chaos people go looking for it the way they go looking for light. Liza made herself useful shelling peas and memorizing the way Nora seasoned gravy by smell alone. Toby followed Boone whenever he could, solemn as a little judge. Levi took to the remuda with such hungry seriousness that even the gruff horse wrangler, Miguel Ortega, started calling him Colt, with rough affection instead of annoyance. Not everyone approved. One evening near the smokehouse, Virgil found Nora alone carrying flour and said, "You do well to remember charity can sour overnight." She set the sack down slowly. "Then it's fortunate I'm not living on charity." His smile was thin. "You think men will stand behind a widow with 3 children against me? I think hungry men stand behind whoever feeds them." For the first time, real dislike showed on his face. Women get bold in borrowed aprons. Nora stepped closer until he had to either move or be rude enough not to. And men get careless when nobody's called them liar to their face in a while. He moved. That night, while Boone repaired a harness by lantern light, Nora told him what had passed. He listened, fingers still working the leather. At length he said, "Folks call a person a burden when they're scared of what that person will require from their conscience." She looked at him. "That line belonged to you." "No, belonged to Ruth." He tugged the stitch tight. She had a way of making a man feel both rebuked and grateful. Nora smiled before she meant to. It startled both of them. Then the storm they'd been walking toward made itself known. At daybreak on the 10th morning, the west fence came down. Not from weather, from a clean cut at the posts. 200 head broke into the draws, and the ranch exploded into motion. Saddles thudded onto backs. Men shouted. Horses screamed. Dust rose in a brown wall so thick it coated the tongue and turned every breath to mud. Boone swung into the saddle with the ease of a man whose body remembered even when his joints complained. Levi lunged for a bridle. "Please," the boy said. "I can help." Nora opened her mouth to refuse. Boone beat her to it. He rides with Miguel. Stays on the edge. Does exactly what he's told. Levi was gone before fear could thank or curse the decision. By noon the sun burned white through dust. By 3, Virgil had sent word through a rider that the cattle buyer would not extend the contract past tomorrow noon. Miss the drive, lose the payment. Lose the payment, lose the ranch. And then, as if the devil admired timing, black clouds climbed over the north ridge. A hard rain in dry country can be as dangerous as fire. It turns dust slick, gullies violent, horses wild-eyed. Boone knew it. Nora saw the knowledge in the way he looked at the sky and then at the scattered herd. "You get everyone under cover," he told her. "What about you?" He cinched his hat down. "I bring home what belongs home." The first thunder hit like a cannon. If you'd been in Nora's place right then, with one child by the stove, one on the porch, and one out under a sky starting to tear apart, Would you have gathered your little ones and prayed the men could handle their own trouble? Or would you have stepped into the middle of it and risked everything for people who had only just begun to feel like yours? Tell me down in the comments what you think, because Nora Whitfield made the kind of choice a life can hinge on. She did not stay undercover. When the far pasture bell rang twice fast and wrong, she knew it wasn't weather anymore. It was panic. She shoved Toby into Mrs. Prentice's arms. The blacksmith's wife had arrived to help board windows and pulled on Boone's spare slicker. "Liza, you keep your brother inside no matter what you hear." Her daughter's face went white. "Mama, no matter what." Nora ran. Rain struck hard and cold, flattening her dress to her legs. Mud sucked at her boots. She grabbed the mule team hitched to the chuck wagon, slapped the lines free, and drove toward the bell through sheets of water and blowing grit. At the north draw, the world had come apart. Cattle heaved in a blind black mass against the wash. Men shouted from all sides. Lightning showed Boone on the bank, horse lathered, arm raised. Miguel was below him, trying to wheel the lead steers. And halfway down the ravine, pinned between a fallen gate and the cut bank, was Levi. Nora didn't think. Thinking was for safer hours. She hauled the wagon broadside across the narrowest part of the draw, yanked the brake, seized the biggest cast-iron pan from the chuck box, and began beating it with the butt of a knife. The clang split the storm. Animals turned. Heads lifted. A lead cow swung toward the sound, then another. Boone saw what she was doing and drove his horse hard to meet the movement. Miguel shouted in Spanish and English both. For one wild, impossible minute, noise and nerve bent the whole front of the herd just enough to keep them from crushing Levi where he lay. Boone dropped from the saddle into knee-deep water. Then Virgil Hayes appeared on the opposite bank with 2 riders behind him. Even in rain, Nora recognized deliberate malice. Those men were not helping. One carried fencing nippers still hanging from his belt. Revelation arrived not like lightning, but like a door clicking open in a dark hall. Virgil had not waited for disaster. He had made it. Boone saw it too. He had one hand on the gate pin and one on Levi's collar when Virgil shouted, "Sign the pasture over, and I can still save what's left." Boone answered with a sound Nora would remember the rest of her life. Not a word. Something lower, older, carved straight out of fury and grief. The gate shifted. Levi screamed. Everything after that moved fast. Boone wrenched the timber high enough for the boy to drag free. One of Virgil's riders tried to force his horse down the bank. Miguel cut him off. The cattle surged again. Nora kept beating iron until her arm went numb. Rain ran into her eyes. Mud stung her shins. The smell was wet hide, fear, and earth ripped open. Then a shot cracked through the storm. Boone jerked sideways. For one terrible second, he stayed standing from sheer refusal. Then he went to one knee in the wash with red spreading dark across his shirt. "Boone!" Nora's voice tore out of her. Virgil backed his horse. He had not meant to be seen. He had not meant to need a gun. Cowards never do. He wheeled and vanished into the rain with his men before the rest of the ranch hands could reach the bank. Nora got to Boone as Levi stumbled out of the mud, crying and half apologizing through his fear. The bullet had scored Boone's ribs instead of going deep, but blood and water made the wound look worse than it was. Still, he was pale under the rain, and when she tried to help him up, his breath hitched in a way that frightened her more than blood ever could. "I'm all right," he said. Men are always liars at exactly this point. Even hurt, one corner of his mouth moved. They got him back to the line shack before dark because he refused town, refused the doctor, refused everything except not bleeding to death on a muddy saddle. Nora cleaned the wound by lamplight while thunder rolled away east and left the world raw and dripping. He sat on the bunk stripped to the waist, skin marked by old rope scars and newer loneliness. She could feel the heat of him even through the cool, wet air. Outside, rain fell from the eaves in a steady silver tapping. Inside, the room smelled of whiskey, wool, and the bitter, clean edge of carbolic from the little medicine tin. When she pressed the cloth to his side, his hand closed hard on the mattress. "Sorry," she murmured. "I've had worse." Not from me. That made him look at her. For a while, the only sound was the rain and his breathing. Then he said, very quietly, "Ruth died in weather not so different from this." Nora's hand stilled. She was carrying our little girl. Fever took hold. Doctor was 12 miles off. He stared at the wall as if the boards had kept the memory for him. I left at dawn with a herd because a contract said I had to. Told myself I'd be back by nightfall. Storm pinned us in the cut. By the time I got home, he swallowed once. I've spent 11 years being exactly as alive as duty requires. Not one breath more. Something in Nora cracked open at that. I was with Daniel when the fever started, she said. I sent him out anyway. Said if he missed the freight run, we'd lose the room and the stove and all the rest of it. He died in a strange bed trying to earn enough so the children wouldn't. Her voice thinned, then steadied. I've been angry at him for leaving and angry at myself for sending him ever since. Boone let that sit between them with the respect grief deserves. At last he said, lonely ain't the same as strong. It just lasts longer. There are lines that feel less like dialogue and more like a hand laid carefully on the part of you that has hurt for years. That was one of them. Nora bound the last strip of cloth around his ribs and tied it off with fingers that shook only when the work was done. Boone looked down at her hands, then covered them with his own, large and warm despite the chill. Nora. It was only her name. The way he said it made it the truth of a whole unwritten thing. On the peg by the bunk hung the blue apron, damp from rain. One pocket turned out. Something had nearly slipped free in the storm. Nora reached inside and found a folded receipt, then another, and beneath them a page torn from Virgil's own ledger. The original, not one of Boone's copies. It showed payments made, interest falsified, cattle transferred under false weight. She stared at it, then at him. You knew I'd keep papers in the apron. Ruth always did. For the first time since she had arrived, Nora laughed. A small worn sound, but real. Liza knocked softly then and came in with Toby half asleep against her shoulder and a little wooden horse in her hand. He wouldn't settle without saying goodnight. Boone took the horse. It had been whittled rough and loving, one wool slightly crooked. Levi made that, he asked. Toby did, Liza said with grave pride. Levi just fixed the legs. Boone turned the toy over. His big thumb brushed the crude carved mane. Then he handed it back to Toby and said, Good work, son. Toby beamed in his sleep-drunk way and reached, not for Nora, but for Boone's uninjured hand. That was the moment the room changed. Not into safety, but into something with roots. If this story is moving you, then you are exactly who we tell these stories for. A like and a subscribe lets us keep lighting this kind of fire for folks who still believe tenderness and courage belong in the same room. And now, because dawn was coming, Nora had work left that would decide who owned the world after it broke. They rode into town at first light with the herd Boone had saved, 20 hands at their back, and a silence sharp enough to shave with. Boone stayed in the saddle by stubbornness and bandages. Nora sat on the chuckwagon seat wearing Ruth Talley's blue apron over a clean dress, as if it were armor. Virgil was already at the stockyard scales, smooth as Sunday sin. Sheriff Danner stood nearby with his thumbs in his belt, looking bored in the practiced manner of men who expect money to settle what truth cannot. Virgil smiled when he saw Boone. It faltered when he saw Nora climb down with the ledger page in her hand. Weigh M, Boone said. The first steers went up the ramp. The scale beam rocked, settled, and gave numbers Virgil announced too quickly. Nora watched once, twice, 3 times. Then she walked to the chuckwagon, reached into the box, and came back, carrying her Dutch oven. Virgil frowned. What is this? The pan I've used every day since I came to the ranch, Nora said. Weighed it myself on the mercantile scale in Barlow Crossing last spring. 12 pounds, 6 ounces. Same now unless irons learn magic. A few men chuckled. She set the Dutch oven on the platform. Virgil said, Get that off there. Read it, she said. The beam showed 9 pounds. The chuckle stopped. Nora took off the lid and set it beside the pot. Try again. Still wrong. The buyer from Cheyenne stepped forward. Scales shaved. Virgil's face drained and hardened at once. A kitchen woman doesn't know stock weighing from Sunday hymns. No, Nora said, voice clear enough to carry to the edges of the yard. But a freight clerk's widow knows numbers. And a hungry mother learns quick when a man is stealing food out of her children's mouths. She held up the torn ledger page. Here are the true payments Boone Talley made for 3 years. Here are the false interest charges you used to trap him. Here are the cattle weights that don't match the shipments you sold. And here, she reached into the apron pocket again and drew out the receipts. Are duplicate store tickets signed twice because you counted on a cowboy trusting the man who stood in church beside him. Every head in the yard turned toward Virgil. Sheriff Danner shifted. You got proof those are his books? Boone's voice came rough but steady from the saddle. I do. So does every hand here who got paid light while Hayes got fat. Miguel stepped forward. Then old Clem from the remuda. Then Mrs. Prentice, who had followed with the wives in her wagon because women know when justice needs witnesses. Virgil made the mistake cruel men always make. He reached for his gun because truth had finally taken the room from him. Nora moved first. She swung the Dutch oven by the bale handle and brought 12 pounds of seasoned iron down on his wrist with a crack that rang through the stockyard. The gun dropped in the dirt. Virgil shouted and lunged. Boone was already off the saddle despite the wound. He hit Virgil hard enough to drive both of them into the scale post. Sheriff Danner finally found his duty when half the yard shouted at once. In the scramble, the buyers seized the false beam weights from beneath the platform. One of Virgil's riders, seeing the whole thing broken open and done, tried to bolt and was dragged back by two ranch hands who had their own grievances to settle. It ended not with glory, but with the ugly practical sound of metal cuffs closing. Virgil Hayes left the stockyard white-faced, one wrist ruined, his books under his arm as evidence, his good coat spattered in manure. By sundown the bank had frozen his accounts. The buyer had voided every contract bearing his fraudulent weights, and the mercantile owner, who had been less partner than parasite, was swearing under oath to save his own hide. Complete enough for you? It was for Nora. Some men deserve mercy. Others deserve consequence. Virgil Hayes had confused the first for a birthright and the second for something that happened only to poorer men. Payment on the herd cleared Boone's note. The overcharges returned from Virgil's books paid the hands, repaired the west fence, and bought winter feed besides. Sheriff Danner, being a creature who respected whichever side of town could embarrass him most publicly, suddenly discovered a gift for pursuing fraud. By the first frost, Virgil's big house stood empty and his south pasture was sold at auction to settle debts he had once used to frighten other men. Back at the ranch, the changes came quieter. Levi got a colt of his own to train, on the condition he also learned figures at the kitchen table with Nora every evening. Liza claimed a square of ground behind the cabin for onions and marigolds because, as she said, a place that had nearly lost itself could use something bright. Toby took to calling Boone sir for 2 weeks until one morning he forgot and said Boone through a mouth full of biscuit, and everyone laughed so hard the child looked startled clean into joy. As for Boone and Nora, nothing about them was rushed. People who have been broken late in life do not fall in love like the young. They build it board by board, testing every weight-bearing joint. A cup left warm for the other. A lamp lit in the window. A question asked softly and answered true. The first time Boone kissed her, it was in the pantry with the smell of cloves and flour all around them. And afterward he rested his forehead against hers like a man thanking God without words. By Christmas there were 2 rocking chairs on the porch and 1 set of footprints between the house and Cook's cabin because nobody bothered pretending they lived separate anymore. In February, Boone asked Levi's permission before he asked Nora to marry him. The boy tried for solemnity and failed halfway through because his eyes had already told the whole story. Spring came green and generous. Months later, on a mild evening when the hills were blue clear to the horizon, Nora stood at the stove in the big house wearing the faded blue apron, now mended again where the pocket had torn in the storm. Boone came in carrying a plank for the new table extension because, as he liked to point out, the family had developed a dangerous habit of needing more room. Liza was by the window trimming stems for a jar. Levi was on the porch teaching Toby how to whistle with 2 fingers and no success at all. The stew simmered. Bread cooled on the board. Boots stood by the door in a line no lonely house would ever make. Boone set down the plank, came up behind Nora, and slid one arm around her waist. "What are you smiling at?" he asked. She leaned back against him and looked at the table where 5 plates were set and a 6th waited. Because someone always turned up hungry at the tally place now, and no one was ever sent away. "At this," she said. "At how home is just the place that sets 1 more plate than it thinks it needs." Then she turned and kissed him while the children laughed out on the porch and the last light lay gold across the cottonwoods. And beyond the house the whole ranch opened wide and peaceful, as if the land itself had finally exhaled. Next time, we'll tell you about the deaf seamstress they hid in the back room of a frontier hotel because her own brothers were ashamed of her, and the one-eyed marshal who understood every word she never said.